This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. What do you think of when you hear the name Somaliland? We're getting its horror headlines of civil war, images of Black Hawks crashing down, freaky high seas piracy, and a feeling that here is a country that you should never go to, not unless you want to start an exciting new life as a professional hostage. Yet, while this reaction is common, it's also wrong-headed. Somaliland, you see, is no longer part of the failed state that is Somalia. In 1991, at the height of the Civil War, it broke off from its brother nation, declaring independence. A government was established, borders, a currency, its own army. By the early 2000s, Somaliland was more or less a functional nation, a safe, semi-democratic twin to Somalia's dysfunctional carnage. The only problem? No other nation on earth recognizes its existence. Independent for 30 years, Somaliland still officially remains part of Somalia, ignored by the UN, the African Union, and the USA, even as it represents a path to stability for the troubled region. Today, Geographics is investigating a country that doesn't exist, and how this non-existence impacts its millions of citizens. On the Horn of Africa, along one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, lies an invisible nation. Bordered by Djibouti in the northwest, Ethiopia to the west and south, and Somalia to the east, Somaliland is more than a mere geographical curiosity. At 176,120 square kilometers, it's larger than Florida. Its estimated population of 4.5 million is comparable to that of Oregon. Like those states, it has its own flag, an anthem, its own police force. Unlike them, it also issues its own currency and passports and maintains a standing army. The government in the capital of Hargeisa controls the nation's borders. It has consulates in Washington, D.C., and it plays host to official missions from the UK, UAE, Turkey, and more. But while only the weirdest of weirdos would try to claim that Florida doesn't exist, the opposite is true of Somaliland. Gatecrash the UN and demand to see the Somaliland representative, and you'll instead get pointed to the guy from Somalia. Ask a White House press corps meeting for the president's position on the nation, and you'll probably be told that he doesn't have one. That's because Somaliland is a ghost state, a place that doesn't legally exist. As far as the entire world is concerned, it's part of the gigantic basket case that is Somalia. On the ground, though, the two couldn't look more different. For one, Somaliland is relatively stable. There have been no significant terrorist attacks since 2008. Its waters are mostly untroubled by piracy, and the capital's crime rate is on par with most American cities. And that stability also carries across to the nation's politics. While Somalia last held a proper election back when Elvis was both still alive and under 200 pounds, Somaliland regularly hosts democratic votes. As recently as 2021, a fair election for parliament saw the incumbent government peacefully step aside after losing power, something that apparently not even America is capable of these days. Another major difference with Somalia is the people who make up its population. While Somalis and Somalilanders are ethnically similar, their clan background is very different. In Somaliland, the dominant clan is the culturally distinct Isaaq. Although there are other clans, it's the Isaaq who make up most of the population. Yet, for all its success in not being Somalia, Somaliland is still a troubled place. Most of its GDP of $2 billion comes from remittances sent back by citizens living and working abroad. In terms of riches, it's the fourth poorest nation on the planet. Yet it's not poverty that really holds Somaliland back, that keeps aid and international business away. Nope. It's lack of recognition. States only become official when other nations recognize them. Like a teenage geek at a party, Somaliland has been consistently ignored by everyone from pretty France to dweeby Canada. But while being ghosted by your high school peers can feel like a catastrophe, on the global stage, the consequences really are catastrophic. Every time Somaliland asks for aid, that aid gets sent not to Hargeisa, but to Mogadishu, where Somali politicians are all like, send this to Somaliland? Hard pass. The government can't apply for loans to improve infrastructure, thanks to state warnings, foreign investment is almost non-existent. The reality for its citizens, then, is that they're effectively ghosts, unable to travel on their passports, ignored by the wider world, unable to access basic global services. And all of this raises a question. How did it happen? How did Somaliland come to be so different to Somalia? And why does no one important seem to care? To answer that question, we're going to have to dive deep into the region's history, a history built on colonialism, exploitation, and unimaginable violence. In the end, it was the goats that did it. Well, more accurately, it was the goats and great power competition, but for now, we're just going to go ahead and blame the goats. In 1839, the British Empire had a problem: how to feed the garrison at its new coaling station in the port of Aden in modern-day Yemen. The solution? Establish an agreement with tribes across the Gulf to supply a regular stream of goats, tribes living in what is now known as Somaliland. Although it was mutton that kick-started Britain's interest in Somaliland, that interest quickly grew into something a little more colonial. Pretty soon, France and Italy were establishing their own coaling stations on the coast, triggering feelings of European rivalry. But since Egypt had by now asserted a claim to the Somaliland coast, there was little the British could do but grumble about it over a cup of tea. Until, that is, a series of internal crises put Egypt on its own path to colonial domination, and suddenly London was able to make its move. In 1888, scores of new treaties were signed with the coastal tribes, officially creating the Protectorate of British Somaliland. From London's perspective, it was just in time. Just 4 years before, France had founded its own country of French Somaliland, today Djibouti. A year after the British treaty, Italy would in turn fuse two protectorates into Italian Somaliland, the basis for modern-day Somalia. It's here that we can see Somaliland really begin to diverge from Somalia, and not just in the language of their new overlords. For all they had been quick to snatch up Somaliland, the British were less like, woo, new colony, and more like, oh man, that's a lot of dust. It's a lot of goats. London considered Somaliland such a backwater that aside from the vital ports, pretty much the whole thing was left to run itself according to the old clan structures that were in place for centuries. When a religious rebellion broke out in 1899 under the dervish leader Maximud Kabdule Xaxon, the Brits found themselves protecting even less of the protectorate. Right up until Xaxon's military defeat in 1920 and subsequent death from Spanish flu, the colonial administration was pretty much confined to the coast. The Italian colonial project, by contrast, was far more hands-on. Spared the headache of rebellion, the Italians were able to impose a top-down structure on Somalia. Old clan politics were erased or sidelined, a process that only gathered steam after the first fascist governor was appointed in 1923. By 1936, Somalia was no longer even an independent colony, but rather a mere province of Italian East Africa, alongside Eritrea and freshly annexed Ethiopia. As we come to 1940 then, Somaliland and Somalia had been under separate administrations for over 50 years. To just illustrate how long that is, 50 years ago from our time, Nixon was heading for a landslide re-election, the Vietnam War was raging, and nobody had any idea what a Star Wars was. But the two colonies would soon be joined by one of the most disruptive events of all time, World War II. Italy's declaration of war on Britain in 1940 caught the empire on the back foot. By August, Somaliland had been annexed into Italian East Africa. But it wouldn't stay there for very long. The East African Campaign of 1941 saw the Allies' first major victory. Italy's empire crumbled. In the aftermath, both Somaliland and Somalia were united under British rule. But this wouldn't be the end of the two nations' separate stories. In many ways, this wartime forced union would just be the bloody beginning. Now, just before we continue with today's video, a quick word from our sponsor, Squarespace. So, look, it's still early in the year, still time to make 2022 the year that you take that next step on that big web project that you've been thinking about. Fortunately, Squarespace gives you every possible tool you might want to make your dream a reality. Whether it's a small business, a sports blog, a creative portfolio, or just a page full of the dankest of memes, it doesn't matter. If you can dream it, you can build it on Squarespace. Are you looking to get in and out quick without thinking too much about what your website should look like? Well, use one of their quick, beautiful templates to make a website that's fresh and for you. Or maybe you're more of a hands-on person, you've got lots of opinions and ideas about what exactly your site should look like. Well, Squarespace gives you all the customization options you could ever want with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. Once you're done setting up your website, tinkering with the design if you are so inclined, or maybe just playing around with the colors, there are many extra features that Squarespace provides so that your website can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support. It's everything you could ever want in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next web project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, do it with Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/geographics, and you'll save 10% of your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. 5 years after World War II ended, Somalia was at last decoupled from Somaliland and returned to Italy. But this wasn't some resumption of the status quo. Rather, it was the beginning of decolonization. Come 1950, it was clear British and Italian adventures in the Horn of Africa were over. To make the transition smoother, both nations were given 10 years to prepare their Somali colonies for freedom. In the end, it was the British who bowed out first, but only just. On the 26th of June 1960, London's rule over Somaliland came to an end. To mark the occasion, the Royal Highland Fusiliers sent their pipers to the ceremony in Hargeisa to play the new country's national anthem. However, when they showed up, it turned out that Somaliland didn't actually have an anthem, so they were instead forced to play a bunch of random tunes and hope that nobody noticed. While that detail might seem trivial, it does get to the heart of the problems to come. Somaliland didn't have a national anthem because it didn't need one. Although the new state was recognized by 35 countries, including Uncle Sam, everyone knew its time as a separate political entity would be short-lived. The politics of the country were determined by clan allegiances, resulting in the Somali National League dominating the new legislature. And what the League wanted was to take their new nation into union with its brother. The day after the botched ceremony in Hargeisa, Somaliland's government voted to join with Somalia. The law went into effect the moment Italy officially handed over power on July the 1st. After just 5 days as an independent nation, Somaliland joined Somalia as a single state, imaginatively named Somalia. As The Guardian rightly noted, it is a decision Somaliland has regretted almost ever since. The trouble was that Somali society, then as now, revolved tightly around clans. In Somaliland, the dominant clan were the Isaaq, who, along with the Darod, Hiwi, and Dir, became one of the 4 major clans of the Somali state. 6 if you count 2 smaller clans. Now, this was all fine, so long as everyone got along and those in power didn't play favorites. But if, say, some kind of dictator were to rise up, a dictator who preached non-tribal politics while secretly favoring his own clan, well, step forward that dictator, Major General Jali Mohammed Saad Barre. In 1969, Barre, then commander of the army and a member of the Darod clan, overthrew the government and seized power. He then ushered in a reign of what he called scientific socialism, but what was in reality a mixture of ideas stolen from North Korea and China. It was also liberally spiced with a lot of good old-fashioned clan rivalry. The privileging of Barre's clan spurred eye-watering levels of resentment in Isaaq-dominated Somaliland. But since this was a dictatorship, there wasn't really much that people could do about it, not while Barre was still perceived to be strong. It was only when the emperor revealed his new clothes and the whole of Somalia got a look at his shriveled, flaccid dong that trouble began. In 1977, with Haile Selassie recently overthrown and Ethiopia plunging into chaos, Barre made the mistake of launching the Ogaden War. Intended as a land grab, it instead triggered a major backlash as Somalia's Soviet backers ditched Barre to instead support the more geopolitically significant government in Addis Ababa. The result was a humiliation for Barre, one that made him look weak, a weakness that did not go unnoticed by the victimized Isaaq clan. In 1981, Isaaq dissidents living abroad in London founded the Somali National Movement, or SNM, with the express goal of kicking Barre out of Somaliland. To everyone's surprise, they would succeed within 10 short years, but only at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Isaaq lives. The descent of Somalia into clan warfare was to Somaliland what the breakup of Yugoslavia was to Bosnia, the starting gun on a marathon of slaughter. As the SNM launched guerrilla operations, Barre refused to negotiate. Instead, he ramped up the oppression, declaring, "When I leave Somalia, I will leave behind buildings, but no people." In the case of Somaliland, he was sadly wrong in only one respect. He didn't leave behind any buildings either. After years of increasing oppression in Somaliland, the civil war finally exploded into overdrive in 1988. Across 2 years, it's estimated that Barr's forces massacred 200,000 Isaaq. This included the standard grim list of summary executions and attacks on civilians, but also some truly staggering military actions. The Hargeisa Holocaust was the carpet bombing of the Somaliland capital by fighter jets, an operation which saw 90% of the city reduced to rubble and untold numbers killed. Today, it's a grim joke among Hargeisa that theirs is one of the only capitals to have been destroyed by planes that took off from the same city. But at the time, there was nothing even grimly funny about it. The annihilation was so complete that Hargeisa was nicknamed Africa's Dresden after the German city firebombed in World War II. Yet the terrors inflicted on Somaliland didn't stop there. The region's second largest city, Barrow, was likewise obliterated. Out in the countryside, people were rounded up by the thousands, shot and buried in mass graves. At least 200 of these pits have been uncovered since the war's end. But despite his superior firepower and superior bloodlust, this wasn't a war Barr could win. After falling out with the USSR, Barr had pulled the classic 20th century tyrant trick of relying on the United States to prop up his regime as a bulwark against communism. Now though, Uncle Sam was starting to get mighty uncomfortable about all these dead civilians. At the same time, Barr's actions were emboldening other clan militias to rise up, to strike at a dictator now almost universally despised. With his support and power crumbling, there was no way that Barr could hold on. The Somali central government utterly collapsed in 1991 as Barr fled the country. By then, the various clans and militias weren't just fighting the regime, but also one another, locking the country into an incredibly messy series of civil wars, the beginning of Somalia's modern dysfunction. But not in Somaliland. As the whole of Somalia plunged into chaos, the elders in Somaliland called a grand shir, a meeting of all various clan and sub-clan leaders to try and hammer out a peace deal. This was only possible thanks to the region's unique history. Remember how the British had been so unwilling to get properly involved in Somaliland that they left the old clan structures in place? Well, the payoff was that the people in 1991 still therefore had a lingering respect for their elders. They were still used to the system of tribal politics. So when the Grand Shir issued a charter for stopping the violence, everyone just kind of put down their guns and did as they were told. But it wasn't just peace that the Grand Shir was after. On May the 18th, 1991, a proclamation was issued that was breathtaking in its ambition. Somaliland would dissolve its union with Somalia with immediate effect. From this point on, Somaliland would be an independent republic. It was a game-changing moment in Somaliland history, one that would put it on a far more stable, far safer path than its former sibling. There was just one teeny-tiny issue. How do you forge a successful new state when no one believes that you exist? If you were a bookie in 1991, the odds you'd have given on Somaliland succeeding would have been somewhere up there with a garish, blonde-haired New York property tycoon one day becoming president. Next to impossible. No sooner was independence settled than fighting broke out between some Isaaq sub-clans, a process made worse by everyone being super heavily armed. On top of that, the S&M's guerrillas were still the only law of the land, a land that wasn't even entirely within their grasp. At independence, Somaliland only controlled about 60% of the territory that it laid claim to. Within that 60%, most infrastructure had been destroyed, the capital city bombed flat, and nearly everyone still alive was suffering some next-level PTSD. Oh, and there was no money, no agreed political structure, and in the Sanag and Sul regions in the east lived a bunch of tribes who rejected independence and wanted to stay with Somalia. But, as that garish New York tycoon showed, sometimes the impossible happens. In Somaliland's case, the key dates were 1993 and 2002. In 1993, the clan elders looked at the mess their nation was still in, went all like, no, that won't do, and called another conference. There they drew up a national charter for a sustainable political system, one with separate legislative, executive, and judicial branches, one with a bicameral legislature, including one elected house and one unelected house of elders. Importantly, the charter also set out the establishment of a police force, one which would require all militia in the country to voluntarily disarm. And here's the thing, they kinda did. The first president, Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Igal, made it a point to demobilize all private forces, including the S&M. The end of armed groups meant the end of the brewing inter-clan conflicts, but it also meant a chance to breathe, to start rebuilding the cities that were flattened in the war. Still, it would take nearly another 10 years before Somaliland made its last great leap towards stability. In 2001, a referendum finally approved the concept of multi-party democracy, even if the number of legal political parties ultimately maxed out at 3. The first vote was held in 2002, and to the world's amazement, it was mostly a success. Since that important date, multiple presidential and a couple of parliamentary elections have taken place in Somaliland. No mean feat when your neighbours are authoritarian Ethiopia, even more authoritarian Djibouti, and, well, Somalia. Sure, there have been problems. The 2011 parliamentary elections were delayed by 10 years, only taking place at last in 2021. But with even just irregular peaceful transfers of power, Somaliland is doing better than many ever predicted. And that's true in a lot of ways. From a bombed-out ruin, Somaliland cities have risen again. Civil society as a whole works. Private business has returned. The education system improved. Even the security situation is light years ahead of its neighbour. While Somalia proper suffers endless atrocities, Somaliland hasn't seen a major terrorist attack since 2008. Even many European nations can't say that. Given all that, you might be wondering why the world doesn't just accept this poor but stable nation. Why the UN doesn't just bring a spare chair to its next meeting and ask the Somalilanders to break bread at their table. Sadly, the answers will leave you with little hope for this invisible nation's future. For all we've been trying to emphasize that Somaliland is something of a miracle, we'd be lying if we said it was perfect. Although there is parliamentary democracy, clan loyalties mean that pretty much everyone in any important position is from the Issaart clan and its subgroups. While analysts have credited this monoclan culture with helping the country stay at peace, it has effectively excluded non-Issaaq from political life. In the West, the Deer clan holds some power, but in the East, it's a whole other story. Egged on by Puntland, another part of Somalia that broke off and declared autonomy, although not full independence, militias from the eastern Darad subclans still reject Hargeis's authority. But for all its political problems, the real reason Somaliland's luck is unlikely to change goes much deeper. Simply, there's too many people who want them to fail. For the UN, USA, and EU, the roadmap out of Somalia's endless conflict is to re-establish the state as a viable whole, something that would require Somaliland coming back under Mogadishu's control. Meanwhile, the major continental player, the African Union, has a different set of worries. Ever since its days as the forerunner organization of the African Unity, the AU's position has been that redrawing colonial borders on the continent will only lead to chaos and bloodshed. By this logic, recognizing Somaliland might encourage countless secessionist movements, leading to countless civil wars. There's also the grim facts of precedent. The two most recent times borders were allowed to be redrawn, they resulted in the mad dictatorship that is Eritrea and the basket case that is South Sudan. And finally, the Somalia itself. Although effectively a failed state, Somalia could still choose to negotiate with Somaliland on dissolving their union. But, like an abusive partner, Mogadishu refuses to even consider the idea of Hargeisa going off without them. Of course, Somalilanders have answers to all of this. As government officials are fond of pointing out, they wouldn't be the first African nation to end a voluntary union. Egypt and Syria got divorced in 1961, while Senegal and the Gambia spent most of the 1980s in confederation before splitting. On the border issue too, they argued that they don't want to change colonial borders, but revert to them, to make their nation as legally distinct from their neighbour as British Somaliland was from Italian Somaliland. While these are good arguments, though, they haven't been enough to overcome the global lack of interest. As a poor nation with no natural resources to exploit, Somaliland simply isn't in anyone's radar. There's no David and Goliath narrative that journalists can hang on to, as with Taiwan and China. No religious flashpoint like the one that makes so many people invested in Israel and Palestine. Nothing but dust, goats, and millions of people desperately waiting for the world to acknowledge their existence. Is there a solution to Somaliland's predicaments? We just don't know. With so many vested interests and so much international inertia, it can be hard to imagine things changing. And yet, there may be a light at the end of the tunnel. As more and more decades slip by and Somaliland remains stable while Somalia continues to, be Somalia, foreign investors are gingerly starting to dip their toes into the water. In 2021, Dubai's DP World signed an agreement to invest heavily in the port city of Berbera, including plans to develop a special economic zone. It's not much, but in a nation starved of any foreign investment for 3 decades, it represents something important. Hope. Hope that in the near future, the world might finally start paying attention. The story of Somaliland then may not be over. It may be that the next chapter is still being written, the one its citizens have prayed for decades. The one telling the story of how finally, at long last, the world came to recognize Africa's invisible nation. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do use that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one. And thank you for watching.